launching a series today. The focus is all around cyber resilience. A privilege to have two great individuals join us today. As you can see on the screen, Ron Ross. So Dr. Ron Ross is a fellow with the National Institute for Standards, and he is one of the key authors of NIST Special Publication 800-160, Volume 2, which is completely focused on cyber resilience. So Ron, we're really very happy to have you here with us today.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate it. Glad to be here.
Thank you. And we also have a luminary in this space, Jim Routh. Unfortunately, we're having a little bit of an issue with Jim's video, but we have him on audio. And Jim is the former CISO at MassMutual, Aetna CVS, JPMC, American Express, list goes on. Very well known within our cyberspace as is Ron. And Jim, thank you for being with us today as well. Ron, let's just kind of kick off here and talk a little bit about the theme of cyber resilience to start us off. So one of the things around resilience overall that we've seen for many years, right, from just thinking about it in principle, from a business sense, if you will, is all about, how do we keep on operating our business? And if you look at kind of sliver of it around technology, that historically is looked upon maybe as kind of disaster recovery, business continuity, specific areas. But what we're doing is really putting this kind of lens and focus on it from a cyber-oriented point of view. And a lot of the work that you've done, right, is defining these particular areas is in that space of defining the specific kind of goals and objectives and techniques. But I want to look at it high level and just kind of in a simple way of saying, when you think about cyber resilience, what do you define that as being?
Well, when I look at cyber resiliency, I look at it more in the systems context. And, it really starts, the conversation starts with our massive dependence on information technology. You really have to start kind of roll back the story a little bit in our fantastic technology, our innovation that's been driving the industry for the past couple of decades. And that technology has really resulted in an enormous amount of complexity at the systems level with hardware and software and firmware. We're talking literally trillions of lines of code, billions of devices. We're talking about ubiquitous connectivity going from 4G to 5G. And all that complexity ends up in a system that's composed of various system elements. A lot of those are commercial products, from operating systems to firewalls, network devices, lots of applications and middleware. And all of that complexity really is driving this whole discussion about resiliency, because in that complexity, from a cybersecurity perspective, that really equates to something we call attack surface. It's the surface that is presented to the adversary that allows them to launch a cyber attack with a threat that could exploit a vulnerability that could cause some kind of mission or business impact. And they do that in a wide variety of ways. But what makes cyber resiliency so important today is that our complete dependence on this technology and the size of that attack surface, we have to come up with ways that allow us to absorb a cyber attack after we do everything that we know we have to do with cyber hygiene, all those fundamentals. I call it the blocking and tackling of cybersecurity. Beyond that, what do we do when the adversary manages to get by those initial defenses, much like that happened in SolarWinds and all the other attacks that have been so well publicized? And to me, what that means is being able to limit the damage the adversary can do, either in time or in space. In other words, don't give them enough time on target to complete that attack chain that they have to go through in order to complete a successful attack. Or the other thing is to make it so difficult, once they're inside the system, to move laterally. There's been a lot of work with zero trust architectures and zero trust concepts that really increase the adversary's work factor. So both of those, limiting the time on target and limiting the ability to move laterally, increasing work factor, what that does is it allows you to limit the damage the adversaries can do once they're inside. And that really allows you to continue your critical missions and business operations, even if you're in a degraded or a debilitated state. In other words, I call that limping over the goal line.
Right. I think, so we kind of pause there for a second. Jim, I want to pull you into this now and put the focus on it from your experiences and just kind of how are you seeing this play out, right? If you just think about it, both of you think about this as it relates to the past year's impact, right? And people organizationally having to make that pivot to the work from anywhere type of environments? Do our systems sustain these people coming on and onboarding them and able to deliver for the business remotely? Everything else that kind of came along with that as it relates to people were saying, hey, we're going to kind of pause or slow down this whole effort around digital transformation and moving to the cloud. But things got really accelerated pretty heavily last year. So Jim, I kind of look at it, your point of view, what's happened? What are you seeing in that whole theme of resilience?
I think first and foremost, our expectations going into the transition to work from home environment for all of our enterprises were based on the assumptions that the infrastructure would not hold up, that some parts of the infrastructure either are private enterprise specific infrastructure or public infrastructure like Zoom would not hold up, given that most of large enterprises never moved their entire employee population to a work from home model in one fell swoop in a concentrated way. Most often large organizations say, hey, business division A, Friday's your day, you're gonna work from home and we're gonna test all this out. And business division B, you're gonna do that on Monday and so forth. And so what we learned going through this is coming out the back end, the infrastructure held up pretty well. As a matter of fact, the level of resiliency baked into the infrastructure, I think, exceeded all of our expectations. So that was kind of major message number one. Major message number two, there are a lot of baked in assumptions about work activity in a physical or on-prem situation that carried over for generations and for decades, that into certain assumptions about what people will do and won't do, what will make people productive and not productive. And basically all of that was discarded as we realized that we can actually get work done in a work from home model. It wasn't just limping along for a few days or a few weeks for that matter until normalcy reoccurred. It was we were able to actually do business and actually in many businesses thrive. The third is the point, Rob, that you were making, I think that Ron addressed, is that it actually accelerated the digital transformation in many respects. Now, I work for an insurance company that launched an insurance product in 2 weeks during the first month of the work from home model. So they transitioned every single employee to work from home and launched a product. Now, look, I've been in financial services for a long time. It takes 2 years to launch a product.
Right.
And
right.
They did it in 2 weeks and just blew away all expectations. And so the reality is that the strategy from an IT perspective that was fairly aggressive at moving to cloud and moving to like a zero trust edge kind of network was kind of in the plans and got accelerated by the pandemic impact. And so many companies and enterprises are seeing accelerations of their business strategies as a result of that. Now, look, it's had significant business impact. It's had significant personal impact. And frankly, my own opinion is most of the impact holding back the enterprise today is in the human. It's not in the infrastructure. It's the fact that we have to realize that back in March, when we dove into the work from home model, we did so reinvesting the benefit of no commute time. We reinvested that into work activity. And that actually is not a sustainable model. Neither is doing Zoom calls, 10, 15 Zoom calls in a row. It's not a sustainable model. And so what we as leaders have to do, and this is maybe not germane to cybersecurity specifically, but it's certainly germane to resiliency, is we have to take care of our health first, our dependence needs second, and then we have to fit the work activity around those first two things, meaning the work activity has to adjust. And as enterprises, we're adjusting to that. As people, we're adjusting to that. And it's moving us towards what I think is a more sustainable model from a human-centric perspective to deal with the challenges of my kids, are making noise while, a Zoom conference is going on. Hey, that's normal.
That's normal now. Exactly. Yeah.
So, so I think that's really the major lesson learned is this is more about dealing with the human aspects of the pandemic. And that's what we're responsible for as enterprise protectors.
No, I couldn't agree more. You make some very key points there. Before, Ron, I kind of go to you to talk about more of the key goals. I just want to remind everyone that we will be taking questions towards the end of our conversation today. So please go ahead and submit them in the chat, and they will be reviewed towards the end of our conversation today. So Ron, kind of carrying across back into, as we were introducing the goals of cyber resiliency, and you were hitting upon them kind of in your explanation of what it really means to be resilient, and Jim was talking about this as well. How do you kind of flush those things out, right? There's the whole emphasis around being as prepared as possible, right? And so, planning for the worst case scenarios, but then there's these things coming out of left field, kind of the black swan type event. You're never going to understand kind of what it is that's coming your way, and how do you kind of bounce back off of that. So that's that minimizing the impact, right? Withstanding that impact aspect, and then recovering as quickly as possible. Kind of walk us through, what you're seeing as some of those areas there, some key principles that organizations really should focus their attention on and kind of go through that type of approach or model.
Well, I think the first task is to try to reduce and manage complexity within the enterprise. I know NIST is probably no different than every other organization. We have a lot of applications. We have a lot of things going on, a lot of systems. And I remember back after the OPM breach in 2015, when DHS, Department of Homeland Security, they had a task of going out to every federal agency and defining what their high value assets were. So they could actually do a better job at protecting those things that are most important. And that's really the essence where we started our FISMA work back in 2003 with our FIPS 199. It's called the triage standard. It requires every federal agency to categorize all of their data and all their systems, either low impact, moderate, or high impact. And the whole purpose of that was to try to make your decisions simpler and be able to provide the appropriate protections for those things that are most important. So I think the first thing I would try to do is eliminate everything within an organization that's non-essential. When you separate your data and your systems into those categories, high impact systems, high impact data are things that can cause a severe or catastrophic impact if there's a compromise or a breach. And once you've identified those critical assets, then I think the next thing I would do is take more of an architecture and engineering approach. You almost have to go down and look at each of those system elements, whether it's an operating system or an application. What kind of security is provided within those individual components? Sometimes they're commercial, many times they're commercial products. And so you have to go based upon what the vendor tells you, those safeguards that they've incorporated into those products. But then there's the thing that you can control, all of the different products that you select, all of the connectivity amongst those products within what you're calling a system. And then the interactions of your system with the external world. In the SolarWinds case, we had a lot of companies that were impacted because they pushed a software update with malicious code in that update. And so you almost have to take an ecosystem view of security because there's lots of moving parts. And there are lots of things where you can simplify the number of components you have. Whitelisting is another good example, limiting the applications that you allow to run. All of those types of activities reduce complexity so you can focus and better manage what you do have responsibility for those things that are really important. And so it really gets back to more of an engineering and an architectural point of view. And that's why we developed our 800-160 series. You mentioned volume 2. We also have volume 1, which is a lifecycle based approach. So I think we're going to have to go back to the fundamentals, looking at architecture and engineering, because that's the way you get better transparency and traceability within what I call the black box. That's the black box of smartphones or tablets or laptops, where you use the capability, but we need to understand more about what's inside the box so we can trust it.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, kind of Jim, pivoting to you, one of the aspects of, kind of going through and assessing what's critical for the particular business and the many different businesses, for example, that you've been in, right? A lot of that translates back into per business, right, per company you're with, and even sometimes the line of businesses within, it's kind of what the risk appetite equates to, right? So a lot of that kind of plays a role, I would think. What have you seen in there in your experiences?
Well, I know when I started in cybersecurity a couple of decades ago, I had this perspective that cybersecurity was really a one-size-fits-all model, that every enterprise needed to follow a specific set of standards and align practices and processes with those control objectives, and maybe get a third party to do an attestation as to the efficacy of the controls. And that was it. That was like, the goal, right? Now the baseline assumption there is that every enterprise has the same risks. And that's fundamentally flawed. Every enterprise today, as you pointed out, it's almost like a different organism. Like enterprises are living organisms, but the characteristics and attributes of how they do business, even in the same industry, is fundamentally different. And that creates a different attack surface. So what's an example of a different attack surface? Well, number one, in the post-pandemic world with a work from home model, well, guess what? Our service providers working offshore are also working from home. And the integrity and the resiliency of the last mile of infrastructure for wherever they might be located may not be up to what we expect in this country, in the US. And so the physical infrastructure is fundamentally different. The extension of the attack surface to the last mile changes the risk profile for those companies that use offshore resources intensely and share, sensitive information with them. Well, that is not true for every company in the same industries. Other companies decided they're going to do more onshore work effectively without offshore. Well, their risk profile is fundamentally different, and what they want to do to manage their resiliency is going to be different than what the other enterprise needs to do. So the reality is there isn't a one size. There's standard frameworks are essential, no question about it. But the risk profile, and your point, Rob, the risk appetite will differ from enterprise to enterprise. And we as cybersecurity practitioners need to recognize that. Now, the other point that Ron made, which is just so essential, is the ecosystem has changed. So as an example, I mean, Ron and I, when we started, we wrote code, right? Now, Ron was a lot better than I was. I was a lousy coder, but that's how I started, right? And I used to think about, wouldn't it be great if I could use some of Ron's code in some of my programs? I'd get a higher level of resiliency, and I'd take less time having to troubleshoot it and find the bugs, right? And so that's kind of what we were thinking of. And then we said, all right, well, what if the enterprise could have all their developers access to a repository to share code? And before that ever manifested itself at scale in a significant way, the internet opened us up to cloud repo services like GitHub and GitLab and Bitbucket. And now we have the ability to use other people's code that they've written, open source code that they can now assemble in like a Lego box fashion as opposed to writing code. And the software development and maintenance and enhancement process is fundamentally changed. And it's an extension of a new ecosystem. But it turns out that conventional, well-established part of risk frameworks, controls for access management have to apply to this new ecosystem for the developers that have access to the repos, because that's how the SolarWinds exploit manifested itself and impacted so many organizations, is they poisoned the supply chain, and the control was pretty simple. It was a password, that was compromised, and look what it did in terms of the significant impact. So forget about the scope of SolarWinds that's still evolving and how many supply chains were impacted, because it's certainly more than one. Fundamentally, all of us as enterprise practitioners need to say, okay, let's apply something we know how to do, identity access management, to repository management from a developer standpoint, and then and basically have some better password hygiene around that at a minimum, and then think about repository management as an IT core service or product that's supporting the enterprise. And so that's a third-party governance implication. Let's put some controls in place for repository management, recognizing that it's core to the supply chain for us as an enterprise and everyone else, every other enterprise out there as well. And these are things that we can do today based on the information that we have today. We don't need a full, determination of who the threat actor was, although most of us have a pretty good idea. We can take these actions today and should as a way of protecting ourselves against the challenges of the attack surface within this large ecosystem that we now operate in today, very differently than we did when Ron and I started way back in the day.
You started coding way back when, right? I think what's an interesting kind of perspective of that, as you were talking about it, is it ties back into resilience. And it's lessons learned, right? It's evolution. What can we do better? What did we learn to be able to improve our security capabilities going forward? So let's pull on that thread a little bit more about the whole theme of really securing the software supply chain. And Ron, I know you've been doing actually a lot of work on this before what came out with SolarWinds. What's your perspective? What do you see kind of as the key aspects that really need to be honed in and focused on, and that we need to do better at overall?
I think this is the most challenging problem that we have in our entire cybersecurity world today, is that we rely completely on industry to produce all of that software and firmware that drive all of those devices out there in this massive cyber physical convergence. So whether it's the software and firmware in your car controlling your braking system, or whether the software is controlling that in that 737 MAX 800 airplane, it's clearly a new world today. And the ability to develop quality software and have a quality, well understood process that people can trust. Again, I go back to the black box. I don't think you have to be a coder or deep into the software development, a software engineer, but I think every citizen, every person wants to know that when they buy a product, especially if they're going into critical systems applications like a pacemaker in your chest or with wireless access, or things that can cost lives or great destruction. I think we have an obligation as a society to develop some level of transparency into these processes with all the companies. Now, look, that's going to open up a huge debate. We've been talking about to regulate or not regulate, and of course, NIST has always been a non-regulatory organization. We're just a bunch of scientists and engineers. But I go back to the example in the automobile industry. My first car barely had a seatbelt. And then I remember my first new car, I had an option to buy an airbag, and I didn't buy the airbag. I opted to buy the 8-track stereo. And those who were over 40 will remember what that was back in the day. That's how we listened to music.
You get girls better that way, I think.
Exactly.
You used to roll down the window too, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But over time, the airbag became not an optional feature. It was standard feature. And then you had the drop-down engine compartments, the steel reinforced doors. And so if you look, and today we have all of the sensor technology, which helps people like me who are approaching 70 years old not to change lanes when I shouldn't. But the point is, it was a combination of regulation and just the automobile industry wanting to give their customers safer automobiles, safer cars. So I don't know where that balance point is in society, but I believe sometime soon we're going to have to figure out where that balance point is, because as we continue this massive cyber physical convergence using mostly commercial products, and that attack surface is getting larger and larger with complexity, we're going to have some well-established, well-understood quality processes that we can attest to. And that doesn't mean you have to get into the knickers of every vendor developing. They have their great life cycle processes, but it's more transparency. When you go to the supermarket, you go down the aisle, you can see all the labels on the different food items, and it gives you some sense of what's inside the product you're buying. So I think that's what we're going to have to do at some point, a better focus on engineering, architecture inside the black box, better transparency, better traceability. So we can actually, as Jim was talking about, when you make a risk-based decision, the quality of that decision, no matter what your risk tolerance is, it depends on good information coming into that senior leader's office, where they are getting enough information to make a credible risk-based decision. Anybody can accept risk. It's a question of, do you really know what you're accepting and what the potential adverse impact is if your systems get breached through not even a black swan event, any type of attack today, to include the most recent ones.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely critical as it relates to where we go from here, right? And we've been hearing a lot about, talking quite a bit about, software bill of materials, because of, as you were mentioning previously, Jim, I'm going to go pull different pieces of code, right? Repositories, open source, and plug it in because it's more efficient. It's better, right? It makes me move faster. It makes me deliver the product to market quicker, which equates more revenue quicker to the business too. So I get that. Jim, if you kind of look at, some different examples within wherever you were in the past, I don't want to pick anything out, no need to call any specific names out, but application security kind of programs. I mean, have you seen just a stronger connection point there on people, really understanding how important it truly is to actually get security, built in earlier in the development lifecycle, and that partnership now between development and security starting to resonate?
There are a couple of things that are foundational to get that partnership to resonate. And I'm going to pick on two things specifically, I think are the two most important. And of course, Ron mentioned the first one, which is the ecosystem focus on quality, and quality being the operative word there. So I think it's pretty clear in most enterprises who owns the quality of a software product. And I think there'd be people raising their hand, said, "Oh yeah, I may run DevOps, but I own the quality of the product," or "I'm a development leader, I own the quality of what I produce." And that's a really important distinction, because our definition of resilience has to be embedded in quality. And the reason for that has nothing to do with risk and everything to do with economics. The best utilization of resource is to create a product with fewer defects. It costs less than creating a product with more defects that have to take additive labor to fix those defects. If we were manufacturing a car instead of software, and frankly, as Ron points out, a lot of what goes into cars is software, and maybe the majority in some cases. But if the car was rolling off the assembly line with dents in the driver's side door, you have two options. One is you bang out the dents, you buff it, maybe paint it if it needs it. But if you can get away with it, you send it off to the dealer and hope for the best. Now you're paying someone to bang out the dents to do that. You're fixing the defects after the fact. And that's one way of solving the problem. Another way of solving the problem is moving the other direction into the manufacturing process, fix the robotics that are causing the root cause of the dents so that the dents don't occur. And then the car rolls off the assembly line, you ship it right to the dealer, and you don't have to pay for the cost of fixing that defects, which in software terms is 10 times what it costs to build it the right way in the development process when you're fixing it after the fact, because you do a pen test and you discover defects. So the first part of this is quality. The second part is accountability. So if you can determine who's accountable for quality, then the cybersecurity professionals have an easier time saying, well, here's the instrumentation for the control necessary to satisfy your requirement for a quality product. As opposed to, hey, build a software and then do us a favor and make sure it's compliant with our standards. That doesn't resonate. Doesn't resonate with developers, doesn't resonate with CFOs, doesn't resonate with anybody, right? And so trying to bolt on security capability after the fact is costly. So the right approach is, as Ron said, take a quality approach and just ensure that you can identify accountability for who's accountable for applying the controls. And if I'm a software developer or a software developer lead, I own quality of the product, meaning it's in my best interest to reduce the defects in that product. And if I can get some tools to help me reduce the defects in that product, then I actually develop software at a lower unit cost and get rewarded for it. And so everybody wins. And if you're speaking to the CIO, thumbs up. You're speaking to the CFO, thumbs up. You're speaking to the CEO, thumbs up. All around the table, thumbs are up. And everybody understands that. So is it better architecture and better engineering discipline, as what Ron is suggesting? Yes. But the context is improving quality of what's produced in the ecosystem and ensuring that the quality is measured and there's accountability for it. And that's the CISO's job, or the cybersecurity professional's job. Instrument the controls to measure quality, and don't talk about risk. Because it's a slippery slope. You don't have to. It's much easier just to talk about quality.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. You actually, I noticed as you were speaking, you used the word defect consistently, and you didn't, I don't think you even mentioned it once, vulnerability. And I think that's key. And I called it out specifically because what I've seen many a time is this kind of clash, if you will, with development and then the security teams, right? The way they're talking, their language, their verbiage, they're after the fact, right? Producing reports and results. And the developers don't understand that language. They look at it as slowing them down. So the key principles you explained and the analogies, the simple analogies that you used, gets buy-in from the top levels, but then it also gets to kind of the synergies working between the development teams and the security teams, right? Use the verbiage that they're used to on the development side. It helps move everything along. So I think that's actually another aspect, which is kind of that cultural and mindset shift into understanding the value of really tagging security in very early. Ron, one of the things, I wanted to kind of get your opinion on, and I know you've even mentioned in the past, is going back to resiliency, and it's that preparation aspect, kind of going back to the start. And one of the key attributes in looking at best being prepared to protect the environments is kind of this concept of making it rather difficult for the attackers to get in or to get to something, right? So kind of going back to your categorization of prioritizing the assets that are most relevant and important. And you look at that, and that's kind of a principle of saying, hey, listen, attackers are going to come at everyone, and what they're going to look at is saying, these are my targets. But if that target's too difficult, I'm spending too much time, that's basically money I'm losing as the threat actor. I'm moving on to my next target. Do you see that as something that people are really adopting to, kind of the essentials, the foundational elements you were talking about, or does that tie in together?
I think so. It's part of that. I call this the multidimensional protection strategy. For the first, I guess the last 40 years of our cybersecurity work, we've really been focusing on one dimension. It's the first dimension is the dimension of penetration resistance. You try to build the wall as high as you can build it. You try to keep the bad guys out. And that works for a time until the attack surface gets so big that you can't manage it all, or the adversary gets better than your defenses. And that happens all the time too. We're up against nation state level adversaries with some of the best and the brightest attackers. We also have really good defenders, but our job is a lot more difficult because of that complex attack surface. So the second and third dimensions that we're talking about now would be, you assume that the adversary gets in. And then the next job is, how do you make their life miserable once they're inside? We call that the damage limitation, damage limiting operations. There's a lot of different terms for it. And that would certainly include things I mentioned earlier about zero trust concepts, zero trust architectures. You collapse the single perimeter and you put that access control and authorization and authentication around smaller pieces of the system. Segmentation, micro-segmentation, micro-virtualization. Any way you can disrupt the internals of the system, you churn the system faster than the adversary can go through their attack sequence. They only have a certain amount of time on target. They have to go through their attack sequence. If you can disrupt that in any way, then it's game over for them. The analogy for zero trust that I like to use is, we all have locks on our front doors, but once that lock is breached and the bad guys are inside your house, they rifle through your house. And if you don't have other internal protections, they can just empty out all your valuables and be on with it. That's why we have safe deposit boxes in banks, because that provides a stronger environment. So if you could picture every room in your house having a vault, then once they're inside the house, they've got to go through every room, vault by vault, and try to breach that. That's a work factor problem for them, and they may never be able to breach. And so that limits the ability to move laterally through the house and to be successful. And the other thing I mentioned was virtualization, micro-virtualization. You're basically churning the infrastructure and refreshing things in the system faster. So if there is malicious code, it's gone very quickly. You can update very quickly. Some of the things that the DoD is doing with Nick Shalane and the Air Force in that DevSecOps project and container-based security and the sidecar infusion of security, those are concepts that really resonate with this whole notion of the second dimension, leading us eventually to cyber resiliency, which is that third dimension where your system operates more like the human immune system. We can deal with a lot of things with our immune system. Sometimes with cancer and things that are like COVID-19, you just get overwhelmed, but most of the time our immune systems are pretty darn good. We'd like to be able to emulate that within our systems.
I know you've used that many times, that analogy of the human immune system as it relates to resilience or cyber resilience. And I think people take that away, right, from our session today. That's one of the key kind of simplest way to think about this, right? As you said, going through examples of like, dealing with different kind of viruses. And then there's kind of these outliers that come along as we're dealing with right now. That's a very kind of core, just simple way to understand the two aspects of that. Jim, one of the things that you've been well known for and have implemented across the board where you've gone is the principle of, and you even alluded to it before, not just taking kind of what the defined standards controls are, applying it, checking the box for compliance purposes, as maybe you initially thought coming into a CISO role way back when, right? Mm-hmm. But the reality is you've taken an approach around unconventional based methods that basically make it that much more difficult, as kind of we were just talking about, for the attackers. Maybe you can share a little bit about your kind of approach that's been very successful in some of the different organizations you've been a part of.
Sure, and I'm going to piggyback off what a metaphor that Ron used, because I really like the immune system concept. So your immune system is working all the time to protect yourself in the environment that you're in as a human. And you don't have to tell your white blood cells, where to go or to produce more of them in order to fight potential infection that you get exposed to. That your body and your immune system is acting totally devoid of your subconscious. You don't have to consciously say, do that, just like you don't have to consciously breathe. You can stop breathing, but even that is in the end involuntary. So the point is that the immune system is a system. There are different layers of protection or resilience to the human body. And there are ways of deploying that using technology and data science today that remove the human from the equation. So initially, Ron is talking about adding friction to the threat actors. This is good. In fact, this is goodness. This is exactly what we want to do, because the threat actor job is actually to really do things at scale, SolarWinds kind of scale. That takes a lot of talent and a lot of patience. And both were demonstrated in the SolarWinds breach. So there's no question that if you add friction to the threat actor, you make their life miserable. So there's a way of adding friction using this metaphor of an immune system that allows us to take data science and apply it to cybersecurity, and specifically identity access management and cybersecurity. And the example I'm going to share is a privileged access management example. So in the traditional or conventional control environment, privileged access management says that when Jim wants access to a resource and an entitlement to use that resource for a period of time, he needs Ron's permission to do so. So there's a workflow with a request that goes to Ron, and Ron looks at it and says, what is this idiot up to again now? And he looks and he says, oh, is this okay? All right, I'll let him have access. It's only for 8 hours. How much damage could even he do in that time? So yeah, I'll grant him access and give him access to that. Now, once that control is exercised, Ron has context that he can apply to what I am or not doing at the particular point in time. And that's privileged access management from a conventional standpoint. checks and balances, clear control, workflow, some automation, ultimately a human applying context, making a decision, situational. That's privilege access management in the conventional sense. Now, I'm going to suggest that privilege access management can operate in an unconventional mode, and here's what that would look like. I request privilege or an entitlement for a specific period of time. Because of my behavioral attributes corresponding into a risk profile, I'm granted access to that entitlement for that period of time. While that entitlement is provided to me, my behavior across anywhere from 50 to 100 attributes, my online behavior across all of these attributes is measured against a pattern that's an established baseline. Each attribute that's measured is compared to the pattern, and a deviation score is created. And that deviation score is aggregated across all of the attributes, and all of this happens in real time through a streaming architecture and models that are representative of the baseline pattern and the deviation. So the deviation is just a mathematical way of expressing whether this activity is similar to the patterns that have been established for this user, Jim, at this point in time. If that deviation triggers a threshold, let's say, it's a 50 on a scale of 1 to 100. Maybe an email message gets generated to Ron saying, Jim's doing something quirky again. Is this okay? If it's a 70 on a threshold, or on a threshold number of 70 on a scale of 1 to 100, maybe it's connected automatically to orchestration that revokes my privilege and automatically sets up in the SOAR system an incident response process to determine the forensics of the likelihood is this is no longer Jim doing this with this privilege, it's somebody using Jim's account. Why? Because the behavior deviates from a pattern. Now, we've talked about, as an industry, cyber industry, anomaly detection forever. And it's always to find the bad guys. But I'm going to suggest something much easier. Find the good guys. You know why? Good guys use your systems all the time. Find the good guys, meaning find the people that use your systems, create a pattern that's established across multiple attributes, and then measure deviation from those attributes against the pattern, and then do something with the thresholds, and you decide what the threshold is and what to do with it, orchestrating it through an existing process. All of a sudden, we have a technology implementation of an immune system in an enterprise, because I don't have to tell the white blood cells to do anything. As the deviation score is high enough, it automatically triggers the right treatment. And in this case, revocation of the privilege. And that makes tremendous friction for threat adversaries, and also offers convenience for the employees, because I don't have to ask for Ron's permission. If my behavioral profile, based on all of the attributes, is scored at the level that's commensurate with giving me that access for 8 hours, then I'll get that access until my behavior deviates from the pattern, which is triggered not by any human action, and done all in real time. The immune system takes action. That's privileged access management, not in a conventional sense, in an unconventional sense. Yeah. And by the way, all of that has been implemented in several enterprises I've worked in. So none of this is theory. This is all, yeah, I don't really do theory that well. This is all practical.
And it's a great example, Ron, of kind of walking through, we talked about for cyber resilience and the framework and everything you guys have laid out within NIST, right? The goals, there's different sets of objectives, but what I'm hearing as Jim was going through the scenario, it's an adaptive response, right? It's a technique called adaptive response, in my opinion, in the way I look at it, right? You kind of have this normalcy. This is what we're expecting. Okay, got it. Everything looks good. All of a sudden, there's an indicator that something's different in the behavior. And then we can respond to it, however, whether it's manual to make you aware of it, as you mentioned, or hey, let's be a little more sophisticated and actually, because we see these things happening, go and automate some of those actual responses to that. Would you say that it's aligned as one of those kind of attributes or one of those key techniques?
Yeah, I think it is, exactly. And that's an example of innovation and thinking out of the box a little bit. And I think this is one of the primary reasons we developed a NIST Special Pub 80160 Volume 2 that you mentioned, Rob. That whole cyber resiliency framework in that document provides a very tailorable set of objectives or goals, objectives, techniques, and approaches. So all the way from the boardroom down to implementation, there's a lot of things you can choose from. And that goes back to what Jim was talking about earlier is, look, every organization is going to have their critical missions and business operations. They all have that unique sweet spot, but they can also take the standardized frameworks out there as a starting point, and they can customize those, whether it's control selection or whether you're using that cyber resiliency framework that we produced. Customize it so it works for the enterprise. And again, that's the key, as Jim was saying. If the CEO and the CFO and the CIO are all on board because you're ultimately going to save money and have better security, making that business more resilient, that's really the bottom line. I think that's the key to our future success.
Yeah, and before we go to questions, there's one more thing that came to mind as you were responding there on, Jim, this is back to you in a conversation that we had maybe a couple of months back. And it kind of played out a perfect scenario for you, which was, if you don't mind kind of just sharing the tabletop exercise that you walked through and got the board buy-in and just kind of that real world experience. I think it's just a great example.
Yeah, sure. We had a situation where 6 months ago, or maybe 8 months ago, there was a lot of flurry of activity in cybersecurity professionals understanding how ransomware was changing. So the threat vector was changing, the delivery mechanism was changing, ransomware as a service was emerging, and then DDoS as a tool for obtaining a ransom was occurring. So ransomware was topical. We were seeing, as we normally do, shifts and changes in threat actor tactics as it relates to obtaining a ransom for monetary value for doing something criminal. So we were asked by the board, by the executive leadership team and the CEO, we were asked to do a tabletop exercise for the CEO and the direct reports of the CEO, essentially what's called the executive leadership team. So we said, hey, great, yeah, this is good because we practice cybersecurity incidents every day in what we do in our incident response process and finding control breaks, et cetera. So let's do it at an enterprise-wide scale against this particular scenario of ransomware, because it's obviously changing and morphing, and we'll learn a lot through the process. So we were all in on the cybersecurity side, said great. So we created a scenario where, in our case, we were looking at agencies. These are independent agents selling insurance. Agencies was the most likely exploit or likely vulnerability in our network. So what if an agency was compromised with either a DDoS attack, or we looked at specifically a ransomware attack and ransomware as a service attack. And we said, well, what are the rules of the road from a enterprise cybersecurity perspective? How do we deal with this independent entity? It's representative of in this case, MassMutual, but how do we deal with that? And so we went through the tabletop, and the CEO and all the executive leaders were unanimous in saying, don't come to us to ask for permission to isolate the agency from the network when there's this type of incident. Do that right in the SOC at the front line. And that was like a real breakthrough, because we had trepidation about that. The second thing they said is, once you do that to protect the enterprise, the second thing you need to do is to solve their problem by providing support for incident response. So legally, we're talking about a different entity, yet tactically, we're saying, cut them off to preserve and protect the enterprise, but then provide all of your resources to help them recover, which is part of building an immune system for the entire enterprise. So there were 28 lessons learned. I've given you examples of a couple of them, 28 lessons learned. And ironically, literally 2 months after the lessons learned were published and put into practice in changing our processes, we rewrote our whole incident response process based on this. Sure enough, 2 months later, we get hit with a ransomware attack. It's ransomware as a service, and it's in one of our largest agents. And fortunately, they had some talent in terms of IT. So we worked with them on the incident response, followed the protocols that were pre-established from the tabletop, and actually disrupted the threat actor. And the threat actor was never able to exfiltrate a significant amount of data and couldn't use it. And they never even sent a ransom note. They just gave up, largely because we basically brought the A-team in there, brought some outsiders in and just swarmed in. And within, a week or two, the agency was, running an optimal way. The enterprise was running an optimal way. And we demonstrated this immune system that Ron mentioned in practice. And the beauty of it, it went from the top of the enterprise all the way down to the engineers in the enterprise and in the agency, all working a model that was pre-established. That's cyber resilience for an enterprise.
Yeah, that's why I asked you to tell it, because it's just, it played out great, didn't it? I mean, it was almost to a perfection, the way you guys were able to go through the scenario and then the reality of what occurred just a couple months later. So it's quite impressive. So we've got a couple minutes left. What I wanted to do is just pull Stan Wisseman into the conversation to kind of just walk through a couple different questions, Stan, that came through that would be of interest to share here with both Ron and Jim.
Hey, thanks, guys. So one of the questions was around supply chain risk management and how do you get started? So Ron, where do you recommend getting started with that whole process to manage your supply chain risk?
Well, there's a couple of things that folks can do in regard to supply chain security. We have a special publication which has been out for quite a few years now. It's special publication 800-161. My colleague John Boyens authored that document, among other folks who participated. That gives you kind of a soup to nuts approach for helping understand what supply chain risks exist and what specifically to do. The other thing, we just released our 853, our privacy and security control catalog, revision 5, a couple of months ago. We added an entire new family of supply chain risk management controls to the 853 document. And there's about a dozen controls in that family. They talk about everything from developing a supply chain risk management plan to specific things you can do to query vendors about the quality of their development processes and provenance and things like that really attest to who's making the software, where is it being made, what kind of quality processes are being used to develop software, firmware, hardware, all those components that you're bringing into the enterprise. It's a very difficult and challenging problem, but I think the answer is to start somewhere, start small, have some small successes, gain some confidence, and then continue to push on that, because it's an enormous problem today, because everything we bring into our systems were being built worldwide, and we have very little visibility into that black box that I talked about earlier.
And Rob, I know we're at the top of the hour, so I'm not sure if we have time for additional questions. But if we do, if we still have folks.
Let's hit another one.
All right.
Yeah.
So Jim, Jim, technical debt impacts your, attack surface and resilience, and sort of like that extra weight that those of us like myself that are in the middle age carry on our body, as you get older. It takes a lot of planning and resources to, replace legacy or end-of-life systems, with modern alternatives that can be patched and secured. How do these long technical refresh cycles impact resiliency, and how have you sort of shed that undesired weight in your organizations that you've been part of, and just, basically build that business case to, replace those systems?
Yeah, Stan, it's a good question. I'll tell you one thing I don't do. I did try this, didn't work out very well, which is a lot of why I don't do it going forward. I don't try to tackle technical debt as a project. and say, hey, we have all this legacy environments. We got 45,000 vulnerabilities in our enterprise. We've got to put Marshall plan together with resources and go after this, and we'll do it for 6, 8, 9 months, whatever it takes, and then it'll be behind us. I never believed in that. I never did that. I will tell you that from my perspective, a cybersecurity professional, the most important decision we make is how to allocate scarce resource to the highest risk. Mm-hmm. And it's the decision that looks the easiest and is the hardest to do. And if you apply it to yourself, it's your time. Where do you want to spend your time? When you apply it to entire enterprise and the resources that an enterprise brings to bear, it has significant consequences. My perspective is this: you build new the right way. And over time, your legacy becomes a smaller percentage of your total portfolio. So you focus on building new the right way. And then as you migrate, and by the way, you allocate resource to where the business needs resource. So if you're building strategic platforms for the future, that's where you focus your cybersecurity energy, and you put the right controls in place to build quality into what you're building, and do that first. Yes, you have a legacy environment. Yes, you have technology debt. Yes, you have significant vulnerabilities associated with that. My home premise here is IT hygiene. Build the right practices in the creation, deployment, and management of your IT resources with the right controls in place to drive quality up and unit cost down. And do that first and foremost. And what happens is that technology debt that represents a huge part of the portfolio starts to shrink in comparison to the overall portfolio. And the enterprise has confidence in the new controls that are optimized to start to whittle away at the technology debt over time, starting with the highest risk in terms of vulnerabilities, and eventually getting down to maybe the middle or moderate risk. And systemically, it's the only way I know how to do it across an enterprise that doesn't take decades, to manage the debt.
Thank you. That's a great answer. And Rob, do we have time for one more?
I think we're kind of up against the clock here, Stan, because we're a little bit over. So what we can do is we can grab some of the questions, and we can also get it back up to the participants specifically that asked those questions. So we really appreciate everyone taking their time again to spend. We hope, I have to believe, because I always learn something new when I'm talking to Ron and Jim, that you also learned something new from today, and you've appreciated the time I spent here. Ron, Jim, as always, thank you very much. We really appreciate the time.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you.